The first signs rarely register as signs. They surface in the muted periphery of civic life where almost no one is paying attention, where the ordinary motions of governance proceed with a practiced calm that conceals the strain beneath it. A minister steps away from a press conference and checks overnight bond movements with the small, quick glance of someone measuring the temperature of a room without wanting to be seen doing so. An editor reads a market bulletin whose tone feels slightly out of tune with the numbers, a hint of caution that does not match the data, yet signals a mood the bulletin cannot name. A senior official ends a meeting with the familiar assurance that everything is fine, fully aware that the reassurance is not a description of reality, but an attempt to hold its edges still. None of these moments feel consequential. They belong to the quiet architecture of institutional life, to the rituals that promise continuity even when continuity is under strain. What shifts beneath them is not the machinery of the state, but its centre of gravity, the deep and largely unexamined belief that public authority anchors collective security. People expect governments to steady crisis, protect infrastructure, and maintain the conditions under which life proceeds. Stability is assumed to be a public achievement upheld by systems designed for resilience. Much of the time, this belief holds because daily experience affirms it. Lights turn on, payments move, salaries land, hospitals operate. The surface remains intact. Yet beneath that surface, another reality grows. Slowly, often over decades, essential functions migrate into private systems that scale more quickly, operate more cheaply, and evolve faster than their public counterparts. Governments rely on them because the alternatives are slower, costlier, or politically impractical. Reliance begins as efficiency. It matures into necessity. Eventually, it becomes a condition the state cannot unwind without harming the public it is meant to serve. The shift does not declare itself through confrontation or disruption. It lives in the altered instincts of decision-makers who begin to measure the safety of public choices through the likely reactions of institutions that stand outside democratic accountability. A policy that might unsettle markets becomes riskier than a policy that neglects public need. A reform that once seemed essential is reclassified as fragile because it might generate discomfort in systems whose tolerance for shock has narrowed. Outwardly, nothing appears broken. Offices function, speeches maintain their practiced confidence, the machinery of democracy operates as designed, yet the weight beneath it has changed. Decisions are shaped by the fragility of the institutions that underpin the state rather than by the citizens who animate it. The drift begins in silence, in small adjustments that accumulate until the appearance of public control remains intact while its substance has already begun to recede. The belief that governments direct the fate of their economy rests on a comforting symmetry. Citizens imagine a world in which public decisions take precedence over private reactions, where elected leaders weigh competing needs and act with a sense of consequence. That symmetry dissolves when a single institution grows so large and so central that its failure becomes unthinkable. Too big to fail is usually framed as an economic description, a way of naming entities whose collapse would harm millions. Its deeper meaning lies elsewhere. It marks the moment when the authority of the state becomes conditional. The legal power to regulate or dissolve a corporation remains on paper, but the practical ability to use that power evaporates the instant hesitation could trigger a wider crisis. A bank that anchors payment networks, holds household deposits, extends credit to businesses, stabilizes bond markets, and supports government borrowing is no longer a firm among others. It becomes infrastructure, and when infrastructure falters, the state becomes the custodian of risks it did not create yet must manage. Regulation in this environment becomes a performance meant to signal competence without disturbing the institution that carries the weight of national stability. Policy turns into a negotiation shaped by the knowledge that the wrong move could provoke a chain reaction the public would bear. The balance of fear shifts. Those who govern begin to anticipate the sensitivity of markets before considering the needs of citizens. This is not corruption. It is the structural instinct of a system arranged around fragility. When the collapse of a single institution can injure an entire country, preserving that institution becomes an act of governance, even when doing so contradicts expectations of accountability. Attention forms at the heart of public life. Individuals face consequences for mistakes. Small firms close when they misjudge risk. Governments can be replaced when their decisions falter. Yet systemically important institutions exist inside a different moral weather. Their choices generate gains that remain private while their failures become public burdens. Losses are absorbed by households, workers, and taxpayers, not through consent, but through proximity. A society that promises fairness must confront the fact that some actors cannot be allowed to fail, not because they merit protection, but because the alternatives are too injurious to accept. As this logic becomes habitual, the substance of sovereignty thins. Citizens continue to debate policy, elect representatives, and demand change. But their influence weakens when the state itself is constrained by dependencies that sit outside democratic reach. The veto shifts from the electorate to the potential shock a single institution could unleash. What remains looks like democracy in form, yet operates inside boundaries set by private fragility rather than public will. The turning point in any system built on quiet dependency arrives without spectacle. It appears as a shift in what leaders fear. When the failure of one institution carries the potential to injure millions, the state begins to govern from a defensive posture rather than an aspirational one. A proposal that once seemed urgent is reconsidered through a narrow lens. A reform designed to protect households is weighed against the possibility of unsettling a balance sheet so large that stress would travel through the entire economy. This is how the horizon of political imagination contracts. Choices that once felt open now feel hazardous. Ideas that once held wide support are reclassified as destabilizing. The horizon shrinks not because anyone intends it to, but because the system has reached a configuration in which caution becomes the governing instinct. In this landscape, institutions capable of transmitting shock function as quiet governors. They do not need to seek power. Their influence rises from the simple fact that their failure would create consequences no elected leader can accept. The state begins to think in terms of preserving confidence rather than broadening opportunity. A budget calibrated for public needs is revised after analysts warn that markets may interpret its ambitions as imprudent. A long-promised reform is delayed because early signals suggest it might unsettle investors whose algorithms will respond before citizens have even heard the details. The reaction arrives in minutes. The public response arrives in months. Under these conditions, the state moderates itself long before conflict appears. Two publics inhabit the same political space. One consists of citizens who ask for schools that work, hospitals that can staff their wards, wages that keep pace with the cost of living. The other consists of creditors and investors whose demands are less visible but far more immediate. Their concerns enter the bloodstream of government through screens pulsing with yields, spreads, and liquidity measures. Timing alone creates an asymmetry. A citizen's disappointment registers slowly. A market's displeasure registers instantly. Over time, governments orient themselves toward the voice with the capacity to inflict the quickest harm, even if that voice has no democratic standing. As this orientation deepens, responsibility takes on a different shape. The state still speaks the language of public interest, but its actions reflect an architecture built around avoiding disruption. Democratic authority remains intact in appearance, yet the space in which meaningful choices can be made narrows. The public sees functioning institutions and assumes the system still responds to collective will. In truth, the system responds to fragility first and citizens second. This is the quiet moment when sovereignty begins to take a different form, not lost outright, but redirected by forces that sit beyond the reach of those it was meant to serve. The historical record shows that this pattern is not new, but a recurring formation in political life. Moments that appear stable often conceal deeper shifts in where power resides, shifts that gather slowly until the state finds itself leaning on institutions it cannot meaningfully restrain. One of the earliest clear examples unfolded in a small republic that believed itself firmly in control of its own affairs. A modest clerk entered a narrow room where ledgers were kept, inscribing another loan extended to the government by a private bank whose reach had grown quietly. The entry was routine. Outside, the street carried on with its daily rhythms. Commerce moved. Public offices functioned. Nothing suggested that autonomy was thinning. Yet each line of ink recorded not just an obligation, but a dependency. Over time, the Treasury became inseparable from the liquidity supplied by a single financial house. With that reliance came hesitation. Proposals that might have constrained the bank's influence were softened or delayed because disrupting the source of credit seemed more dangerous than tolerating its expansion. Officials did not imagine themselves surrendering authority. They saw efficiency. They saw a resource that funded roads, maintained civic order, supported public works. The danger lay not in the visible arrangement, but in the instincts those arrangements cultivated. Leaders adjusted their decisions according to how the institution that underpinned their stability might react. Caution entered the bloodstream of governance. The bank did not need to exert pressure. Its indispensability carried the weight. A later empire experienced the same dynamic on a far larger scale. A private enterprise founded to expand trade grew into a territorial power whose fortunes became intertwined with those of the state. Revenues flowed through official accounts. Armies relied on its logistical networks. Investors treated its dividends as evidence of national strength. When signs of strain emerged, the risk extended beyond a balance sheet. Ministers assessed public choices through the lens of the firm's fragility. Failure would have meant commercial disruption, geopolitical loss, and domestic upheaval. Intervention was framed as reform. Yet the underlying truth held. The state had become contingent on a private institution, whose collapse would have inflicted wounds it could not absorb. Across these episodes, the architecture is the same. Dependency forms quietly and appears rational. Oversight erodes not through explicit capture, but through the state internalizing the risks of those it depends on. Public confidence persists because the outward symbols of sovereignty remain intact, even as the conditions beneath them shift. The lesson repeated across centuries is simple. Power migrates toward whatever the state cannot allow to fail, and the migration often completes itself before anyone recognizes its direction. The modern system inherits this architecture and intensifies it. Financial institutions that operate at national scale do more than participate in economic life. They form the circulatory networks through which salaries move, payments clear, credit expands, savings are stored, and public borrowing is stabilized. When one of these institutions strains, the effects spread at a pace no government can match. A payroll officer receiving frantic messages from staff whose wages have not arrived experiences disruption. In a monitoring room, analysts see the same pattern and understand it as a sign that an institution carrying significant national weight may be faltering. The public encounters inconvenience. The state sees the outline of a crisis forming in real time. This gap in perception shapes the distribution of power long before any formal intervention occurs. When infrastructure becomes fragile, influence takes a new form. A bank capable of transmitting shock through households and businesses acquires a position that does not depend on intention or ambition. Its strength lies in what its absence would cause. Within this configuration, the cost of allowing failure becomes unbearable. Leaders know that a collapse would ripple instantly through mortgages, pensions, savings, shops, wages. The injury would fall on people with no connection to the decisions that produce the risk. That recognition becomes a shield for the institution and a constraint for the state. Executives can pursue strategies that generate private gain because the state must stand ready to prevent public devastation. Accountability becomes distorted. A small business can fail, a household can fail, a local program can fail. A critical financial institution cannot, not because it deserves protection, but because its failure would exceed the tolerances of the society that depends on it. Inside this tension, public power changes shape. Governments intervene during crisis with actions that appear decisive. Guarantees are announced, capital is provided, confidence is restored. Yet each intervention deepens the dependency beneath it. Public debt increases. Reliance on private institutions to purchase that debt grows. Every cycle tightens the loop binding public stability to private fragility. Over time, the loop becomes self-reinforcing. Regulators tread carefully because strict discipline risks instability. Policymakers hesitate because instability risks harm to the public. The authority to impose consequences still exists on paper, but its practical use evaporates when the possibility of systemic shock enters the room. In this environment, the political imagination begins to erode. Leaders govern with an awareness that the range of safe choices is narrow. A reform that once embodied ambition now appears hazardous. A plan to broaden opportunity becomes unrealistic when filtered through models warning of turbulence. Stability becomes a rationale for inaction rather than a foundation for change. The public sees normal life resuming after each crisis without seeing the conditions that made that normality possible. The system functions. The boundaries within which it functions are no longer set by collective will. They are set by the fragility the state has learned it must protect. The crisis that engulfed a nation on the edge of default revealed this structure in its clearest form. It began with the slow fraying of daily life rather than dramatic announcements. A nurse arrived for a shift to find that supplies once taken for granted had run out again. A teacher faced another winter morning in a classroom without heat because the repair budget had been cut for a third straight year. A pensioner stepped to a pharmacy counter only to be told that the medication he relied on might not be available for weeks. These incidents felt local, temporary, inconvenient. They were treated as administrative problems rather than signals of a deeper fracture. Yet each pointed toward a narrowing of the state's capacity to direct its own affairs. As borrowing costs climbed beyond reach, the government turned to international institutions for assistance. The public was told that support would stabilize the economy and that this was a passage through difficulty rather than a structural shift. What arrived instead was a form of rescue that moved through the country without touching the people who lived in it. Funds entered and exited almost instantly, directed toward the repayment of creditors rather than the repair of collapsing systems at home. Hospitals shed staff, schools shortened hours, households watched incomes contract. The promise of relief became the experience of austerity. Inside the government, the sense of constraint was overwhelming. Ministers stared at spreadsheets that offered no room for judgment. Conditions attached to each round of funding dictated pension cuts, tax increases, reductions in essential services. Choices that should have belonged to politics were reduced to technical compliance. Advisors warned that even minor deviations from creditor expectations could jeopardize the next tranche of support. The needs of citizens were filtered through the demands of actors who held the power to tighten or release financial pressure. Public life continued, but the space for self-direction thinned until almost nothing remained. The moment that revealed the imbalance came when leaders proposed returning one of the central questions to the people themselves. A referendum offered a rare opening for democratic agency to re-enter the national conversation. Markets reacted within minutes. Foreign officials expressed alarm. The possibility that citizens might decide their own terms was treated as a destabilizing threat. The referendum was withdrawn. Leadership changed. The message was unmistakable. Legitimacy grounded in public will carried less weight than the need to reassure institutions whose reactions could move instantly through the system. What followed was not the end of democratic forms. Elections continued, debates continued, parliamentary routines continued. Meaningful choice did not. The country had entered a configuration in which sovereignty persisted in appearance while its substance had already drifted elsewhere. The mechanism that binds states to the institutions they depend on does not operate only through balance sheets or capital flows. It also shapes perception. It influences how officials come to understand risk, stability, and responsibility long before any crisis forces their hand. A policymaker sits alone in a quiet conference room after the day's meetings, scanning briefing papers prepared by advisors who once worked inside the very institutions they now oversee. The documents carry familiar assumptions about what counts as prudent, what counts as dangerous, what must never be attempted. None of these assumptions are imposed directly. They are absorbed through repetition, through shared training, through careers that move fluidly between public agencies and private firms. Ideas that serve the public more directly begin to feel improbable, while ideas that protect existing structures feel natural. Instinct shifts without conscious intent. Cognitive capture does not require pressure. Its force comes from alignment. Questions that once seemed necessary begin to appear disruptive. Proposals meant to reduce systemic risk begin to seem unrealistic. The boundary of reason narrows. When a junior advisor suggests separating essential financial functions from speculative activity, the room responds not with argument but with silence. Senior figures mention potential instability. Someone notes that liquidity might tighten. No one rejects the idea outright. The atmosphere of caution does the work. By the afternoon, the proposal has vanished from the agenda. Its disappearance has nothing to do with merit and everything to do with the quiet gravity of a system that disciplines imagination before conflict begins. Over time, this environment alters the purpose of governance. Stability becomes the overriding measure, not stability in the lives of citizens, but stability as interpreted by institutions whose reactions can move instantly through the system. Leaders learn to anticipate those reactions and moderate themselves accordingly. The aim of reform gives way to the aim of reassurance. Policies intended to expand public capacity are recast as potential sources of turbulence. A government may wish to act for workers, renters, or communities, but its decisions pass through a risk calculus that privileges the comfort of institutions capable of transmitting shock. This narrowing affects more than policy. It reshapes the horizon of the possible. Ambition fades, alternatives shrink. The state continues to speak in the language of representation and public interest, yet the choices available inside that language have already been reduced. What remains is a system that functions, but only within limits no electorate has chosen, limits set by forces that stand outside democratic reach. The consequences of this drift become most visible in the rooms where final decisions are made. A cabinet gathers late at night, papers scattered across the table, screens glowing softly in the corners. Ministers speak about long-term planning, public needs, the responsibilities of elected office. Beneath the language, another awareness moves. Each person remembers earlier moments when minor adjustments in policy triggered sudden volatility. When a surprise in a distant sector sent borrowing costs climbing, when a routine announcement produced an unexpected tremor in markets. These memories shape the meeting more than any principle or program. The conversation circles around what can be done without disturbing the institutions that hold the system together. In that circling, the limits of democratic power come into view. A society imagines its choices as wide and its political horizon as open. Campaigns promise transformation, elections present programs, debates frame priorities. Yet once a financial system grows large enough that the failure of a single firm can threaten an entire country, the space for genuine choice narrows. A government may want to strengthen oversight, expand public services, or correct long-standing imbalances. Each proposal is weighed against its potential to unsettle institutions capable of transmitting shock through pensions, savings, wages, and credit. In this configuration, the chain of consequence inverts. A policy that would benefit the public is treated as hazardous because its immediate effect on markets overshadows its long-term gains. A policy that maintains stability in financial circuits is celebrated even when it places strain on households and public institutions. This imbalance alters how governments understand their purpose. They do not declare a shift, they drift into it. A reform that once seemed essential appears too risky. An initiative designed to reduce inequality seems implausible when filtered through models predicting turbulence. Leaders begin to measure success by the calmness of indicators rather than the well-being of the population. The state becomes an intermediary, managing two constituencies. One is visible, dispersed, and slow to exert pressure. The other is concentrated, instant, and able to impose consequences without waiting for deliberation. The predictable result is contraction of public ambition. Citizens continue to believe governments steer the direction of the country, but steering requires room to move. That room diminishes with each cycle of crisis and rescue. Each moment when stabilizing markets is treated as serving the public. Each hesitation shaped by memories of volatility. The political landscape retains its familiar outline. The deeper structure does not. Prudence becomes acceptance. The boundaries of action are set not by collective will, but by the fragility the state sees as unavoidable. A society cannot call itself secure if its public institutions must continually protect private systems whose weakness threatens those they are meant to serve. Nor can it call itself sovereign if a routine correction in an inflated sector is treated as a national emergency. These contradictions shape daily life even when they remain unspoken. Citizens encounter delayed repairs, shrinking programs, decisions that appear cautious to the point of paralysis. The link between these outcomes and the architecture of dependency rarely becomes visible, yet it is exact. When the health of a single institution becomes a precondition for national safety, the meaning of democratic choice changes. Elections still determine governments, but they no longer determine the boundaries within which those governments can act. What follows is not collapse. It is an adaptation to narrow constraints. Leaders enter office with genuine commitments to address inequality, rebuild infrastructure, or regulate sectors that have grown unwieldy. Once inside the system, their ambitions pass through a series of filters. Advisors emphasize the need for confidence. Models warn of turbulence. Memories of volatility exert pressure. The instinct for caution appears long before any proposal reaches the public. This instinct is not irrational. It reflects an environment where instability moves faster than political deliberation. When the consequences of unsettling financial circuits appear immediate, while the consequences of failing the public unfold slowly, governments move toward the path with the least short-term threat. Over time, that path hardens into doctrine. The deeper questions concern agency and accountability. A democracy assumes that power flows from the people, that public institutions act on behalf of those who elect them, that risk is distributed according to collective values. Yet, in a system where certain institutions cannot fail, risk becomes asymmetric. Gains concentrate, losses diffuse. Households adapt, while the structures that created the vulnerability remain intact. The burden placed on citizens is not only economic, it is civic. They are asked to accept a form of stability that protects the system first and the population second. The work ahead lies not only in criticizing this arrangement, but in understanding the conditions that produce it. Societies build resilience by designing systems that can absorb failure without spreading harm. That requires dispersing power rather than concentrating it, strengthening public capacity rather than outsourcing it, and recognizing that efficiency without redundancy produces fragility disguised as order. Until that work takes shape, nations will continue to inhabit this quiet contradiction. Authority remains visible, confidence is performed, yet the real conditions of power operate elsewhere, shaped by dependencies the state supports but does not choose, and by risks it manages but does not control.